the sun blazes down on the sands of Amarna, its heat unrelenting, its brilliance unforgiving. Beneath that merciless light, Pharaoh Akhenaten ruled not only with laws and armies, but with the strange conviction that intimacy itself was a ritual, a sacred act demanded by the god he raised above all others. The Aten, the disk of the sun, whispers carried through the gilded halls of his palace, whispers that would echo far beyond his lifetime, whispers of forbidden unions, of sacred rites that blurred the line between worship and perversion. To many in his time, the heretic pharaoh was not merely a revolutionary, he was an affront to tradition, a man who had dared to twist Egypt's most private taboos into the very fabric of state religion. Akhenaten's reign in the 14th century BCE is often remembered for his bold rejection of Egypt's ancient gods. Where once Amun, Osiris, and Isis held sway, now Aten shone alone. But behind the radical theology lay something darker. The rituals that unfolded in his court were unlike anything Egypt had seen. For Akhenaten, intimacy was never private. It was theatre, staged under the blazing eye of Aten, performed as proof of loyalty and used as a weapon of power. His queen, Nefertiti, was not simply his wife, but his high priestess, her body exalted as divine, her beauty displayed in ceremonies that left courtiers whispering in both awe and revulsion. But even Nefertiti's role was not the limit. Rumors spread that Akhenaten turned inward to his own bloodline, drawing his daughters into the orbit of his sacred rites. The art of Amarna, revolutionary and shocking, depicted father and daughters in poses that ancient Egyptian tradition had never dared to show. Figures intertwined, bodies close, caressed beneath the rays of Aten's disk, each beam ending in delicate hands that offered not just life, but intimacy itself. Were these scenes symbolic of divine closeness, or proof of unspeakable practices within the palace walls? To the nobles who viewed them, the message was unmistakable. The pharaoh's household belonged not to human law, but to Aten's desire, no matter how scandalous it seemed. Imagine standing in those chambers. Silken curtains flutter in the desert breeze. Incense coils upward in the hot, stifling air, and the light of the sun filters through carved windows, bathing the room in gold. Courtiers, priests, and attendants watch in silence as the ruler of Egypt reenacts rituals of creation and fertility, rituals that blend the sacred with the sexual, the political with the personal. To refuse his vision was to defy Aten himself. To question the morality of these acts was to risk being branded a heretic, and so the silence held, broken only by the murmurs of scandal that crept into the city streets outside the palace walls. For in Amarna, sexuality was not just pleasure, it was worship, submission, and control. And for Akhenaten, it was a declaration that he, and he alone, stood as the living vessel of Aten's will. But the real shock was yet to come. For when a ruler makes the forbidden divine, the line between devotion and depravity all but disappears. In the golden courtyards of Amarna, the line between devotion and domination was written not in laws, but in flesh. Akhenaten understood something that many rulers before him had hinted at, yet none had dared to codify so completely. That desire could be the sharpest instrument of power. Where soldiers enforced his will with bronze and chariots, he wielded intimacy as a subtler weapon, binding the bodies and souls of his court to him through practices that shocked even his closest allies. To the pharaoh, sex was never simply indulgence, it was ceremony. Each act, each embrace, became a reaffirmation of Aten's divine supremacy, and by extension, his own. Queen Nefertiti, resplendent in her role as both wife and priestess, was exalted as the visible bridge between humanity and God. In ritual processions, she appeared not merely as a consort, but as a living goddess, her beauty a symbol of Aten's favor. And yet behind the iconography lay a grim truth. She too was a vessel in a theater designed to reinforce Akhenaten's unyielding control. The women of the court, daughters of nobles, slaves purchased from foreign lands, singers devoted to Aten, found themselves swept into a new order where their bodies became currency of loyalty. They were no longer private companions, but instruments of worship, displayed in ceremonies that blurred the line between spiritual exaltation and humiliation. For many, participation was not a choice. Refusal could mean disgrace, exile, or worse. In Amarna, submission was framed as holiness and obedience as divine duty. The psychology of such control was profound. Akhenaten's theology stripped Egypt's people of the comfort of many gods, replacing it with a single, all-seeing eye. The Aten watched all, and through that gaze, the pharaoh demanded constant devotion. In matters of intimacy, this meant that the most private human acts were absorbed into the state's most public rituals. The bedroom was no longer personal, it was political. The family no longer sacred, it was sacrificial. This radical reshaping of taboo unsettled even those hardened by centuries of royal excess. While incest had occasionally appeared in Egyptian dynasties as a means to preserve divine blood, Akhenaten elevated it into an ongoing principle of his household. His daughters were painted beside him, not merely as children, but as participants in Aten's eternal embrace. Such depictions were jarring to priests and commoners alike, signaling a new form of authority where even the boundaries of kinship were erased in the name of divine union. For the people beyond the palace walls, the contrast was painful. Ordinary farmers clung to traditional norms of marriage, fidelity, and fertility, while the pharaoh flaunted their inversion. What was forbidden to them was exalted at court. This double standard reinforced their subjugation. Their ruler existed. Beyond morality, a god-man whose very transgressions proved his superiority. Akhenaten's genius, if it can be called that, lay in transforming intimacy into ritual, ritual into propaganda, and propaganda into power. For every scandal whispered, every rumor spread, his legend grew darker, his authority more unshakable. But the seeds of rebellion were sown, for nothing corrodes loyalty faster than the sense that one man's pleasure has become a nation's burden. The scandal that would define Akhenaten's court did not come in the clash of armies or the decrees of temples, but in the whispers surrounding his own bloodline. Nowhere in Egyptian memory had a pharaoh so openly blurred the sacred bonds of family with the language of ritual. And yet, in Amarna's painted walls and carved reliefs, Akhenaten's daughters appear beside him, not as children tucked modestly away, but as companions, adoring, intimate, positioned in ways that unsettled even the most loyal of courtiers. One figure in particular drew both fascination and dread: Akhenaten, the eldest daughter. She was depicted almost as a second queen, sometimes shown with the same gestures and attributes once reserved for Nefertiti. Her presence in ceremonies grew more pronounced as Nefertiti faded mysteriously from the record, and soon, gossip within the palace suggested that Akhenaten had stepped into more than a symbolic role. Some whispered she had become her father's consort, a living bridge of blood and divinity, chosen to embody Aten's favor. Whether truth or propaganda, the effect was devastating. Egypt's nobility, already unsettled by the pharaoh's rejection of the old gods, now saw him reaching beyond accepted taboos into something darker. The art of Amarna fanned these flames. Unlike the rigid, distant portrayals of earlier pharaohs, Akhenaten had his family painted with shocking tenderness, kissing, caressing, reclining together beneath the rays of Aten. To modern eyes, these images may be read as exaggerated symbols of divine closeness, but to ancient priests, soldiers, and citizens, the suggestion was unmistakable. This was no ordinary affection. It was ritualized intimacy displayed for all to see. And once the rumor began that Akhenaten and perhaps her sisters had been drawn into their father's sacred rites, it could not be contained. For the women within the palace, this scandal carried a heavy cost. Daughters, concubines, and servants were no longer individuals, but ritual objects, extensions of a vision that merged family, faith, and desire into one. To defy the pharaoh's wishes was unthinkable. To participate was to endure the weight of an act that the rest of Egypt would brand heresy. Their lives became the stage upon which Akhenaten acted out his vision of divine union, their suffering masked by golden depictions that made their bodies eternal props of Aten's glory. 3. Aftermath of this scandal rippled through Egypt's power structure. The priesthood, already dispossessed of its wealth and temples, seized on the rumors as proof of the pharaoh's corruption. Generals grumbled in their barracks, nobles muttered in their estates, and ordinary citizens whispered that their ruler had gone mad. Even in foreign lands, word of Akhenaten's excesses reached the ears of allies and enemies. Behind the gilded walls of Amarna, sex was not simply indulgence or ritual, it was politics in its rawest form. Akhenaten's court was a stage where bodies were as useful as soldiers, and seduction could change the course of diplomacy as surely as a treaty. To understand the true depth of his scandal, one must see how intimacy was weaponized not only in private ceremonies, but in the broader games of power that rippled through Egypt's empire. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets preserved, by chance, reveal foreign kings begging for Egyptian gold, daughters, and concubines in exchange for loyalty. Akhenaten himself entertained these exchanges, treating women of his court as bargaining chips, the young singers of Aten, concubines taken from noble families, and even women of foreign birth became instruments of diplomacy. To gift a woman was to bind an ally. To offer her body was to prove Egypt's strength. And yet, each gift carried whispers of exploitation. These women had no voice, their lives transformed into tokens in a game they did not choose to play. Inside the palace, intimacy was even more dangerous. Court mistresses, favored concubines, and even high-ranking priestesses competed for influence. Access to the pharaoh's bed meant more than affection. It meant access to Aten himself, and therefore access to power. Alliances were forged in the silence of private chambers, while jealousies simmered just beneath the surface. One word whispered at the wrong moment could condemn a rival to exile. One lover's favor could determine the rise or fall of entire families. The disappearance of Nefertiti looms large in this shadowed world. Once the radiant partner of Akhenaten, she vanishes from records midway through his reign. Some historians argue she died, others that she was cast aside, still others that she took on a new identity as co-ruler. But among the darker theories, one persists, that political betrayal intertwined with sexual scandal, and that Nefertiti's refusal to participate in certain forbidden rites may have led to her downfall. Whether true or not, her absence reshaped the court, leaving daughters like Meritaten to assume roles once filled by their mother, roles that carried both exaltation and danger. All of this unfolded under the watchful eyes of Aten's cult. The priests of the old gods, displaced and humiliated, saw in these scandals a weapon of their own. Whispers of incest, tales of orgies in the sun's name, and stories of concubines turned into pawns spread like wildfire. Each rumor chipped away at Akhenaten's legitimacy, fueling a quiet rebellion. By making sex a pillar of his political vision, the pharaoh had created both a tool of control and a blade aimed at his own throat. In the end, these power plays left the court fragile, teetering on betrayal. Ambition, jealousy, and devotion collided in a space where every act of desire could shift the balance of Egypt's future. And as the scandals grew, the great experiment of Amarna stood less like a holy city and more like a gilded cage, trapping its ruler in the very web of seduction he had spun. Beyond the palace walls of Amarna, life carried on in the shadow of scandal. Farmers bent their backs under the burning sun, hauling water to fields of barley and flax. Craftsmen carved stone blocks for the great temples of Aten, their wages meager, their hands blistered. And yet, even as they toiled, their ears caught fragments of rumor drifting down from the golden city above them. The stories of Pharaoh Akhenaten's court, of his daughters drawn into strange rituals, of concubines paraded as offerings to the sun, filtered into the streets, marketplaces, and village hearths. For ordinary Egyptians, these whispers were as intoxicating as they were unsettling. Marriage for the common man was practical, grounded in family, fertility, and survival. A husband and wife shared the burden of harvests, raising children and securing a modest legacy. Adultery, while not unheard of, carried social shame, and incest was strictly taboo. To hear that the pharaoh himself had not only embraced, but ritualized such practices was more than scandalous. It was heresy against the very moral fabric of daily life. Farmers and traders shook their heads in disbelief. Priests loyal to the old gods muttered in bitterness. For them, Akhenaten's new morality was a perversion dressed up as divine truth. And yet, there was fascination too. To the lowest classes, the royal court always seemed a distant world, one of glittering power and endless excess. If their pharaoh transgressed, was it not because he was above them, touched by divine forces they could never understand? Some dared to interpret his excesses as sacred mysteries, inaccessible to mortals. Others, more cynical, saw them as proof that the Aten cult was nothing more than a mask for indulgence. Slaves and servants experienced these realities most directly. Imported from Nubia, Syria, and beyond, many were drawn into the pharaoh's rituals, serving as attendants, musicians, and unwilling participants in ceremonies where intimacy was declared holy. For them, survival meant obedience, and disobedience meant disappearance into the desert sands. Their stories, never written, survive only as echoes in the silence of Amarna's ruins. Gender roles shifted in strange ways under Akhenaten. Women, of noble blood, were exalted as priestesses, their bodies framed as divine vessels. But this exaltation was double-edged. To be raised to the status of goddess was also to be stripped of personal autonomy, trapped in a role that demanded constant sacrifice. Common women, meanwhile, endured harsher double standards. Their chastity was strictly policed, their marriages bound by custom, while their rulers openly defied those very rules in gilded halls. This tension between public morality and elite transgression widened the chasm between ruler and ruled. Where once the pharaoh had been seen as father of the nation, Akhenaten now appeared as something alien, part man, part god, part scandal. The very rituals meant to unify Egypt under Aten instead fractured it, leaving resentment simmering in villages, temples, and garrisons. For the people of Egypt, daily life was a struggle for survival, but in their whispers, in their gossip, in their silent prayers to the old gods, they condemned their rulers' excesses. Akhenaten's palace may have glittered in the sun, but beneath that brilliance lay a rot that the common people could not ignore. Every reign reaches a breaking point, and for Akhenaten, the moment came not with a single act of defiance, but with the slow erosion of loyalty beneath the weight of scandal and excess. For years, the pharaoh had pushed Egypt into his vision, a world lit only by the Aten, a court ruled through intimacy as worship, and a family enshrined as divine vessels. But whispers had grown louder, and resentment boiled just beneath the surface. By the end of his reign, Akhenaten's golden experiment at Amarna stood less like a beacon of divine truth and more like a cage of corruption. The turning point came as Egypt's strength faltered abroad. While Akhenaten staged sacred ceremonies with his daughters and elevated concubines into instruments of worship, the empire's borders cracked under foreign threats. Letters from vassal kings in Canaan and Syria begged for Egyptian soldiers to repel invasions, but their pleas went unanswered. The pharaoh was too consumed by his rituals, too isolated in Amarna's sun-drenched halls. For generals and soldiers, this neglect was unforgivable. They murmured that Egypt's king had abandoned war for worship, strategy for scandal. Inside the palace, tensions grew even sharper. Nefertiti's sudden disappearance, whether by death, exile, or political betrayal left, a void that Akhenaten seemed to fill, her presence in official ceremonies unsettling even the most loyal courtiers. Whispers of incest became open condemnation in private. Priests of the old gods, stripped of power, quietly stirred dissent, pointing to Akhenaten's perversions as evidence of divine punishment. Each drought, each famine, each military loss was laid at the feet of the heretic king who had not only abandoned Egypt's gods but desecrated the sanctity of family itself. For many, the scandal was no longer tolerable. The pharaoh's household, once the model of divine order, had become a stage for forbidden unions, a symbol of heresy and shame. Where past rulers were exalted as fathers of the people, Akhenaten was now reviled as a tyrant consumed by his own lust. Even his courtiers, bound by fear and ceremony, began to turn away, their loyalty cracking with every ritual that demanded their silent complicity. The breaking point was quiet but decisive. Dissent did not erupt in a sudden coup, but in withdrawal. Loyalty withered, alliances fractured. Soldiers and priests refused to enforce the pharaoh's will. By the time Akhenaten died, the city of Amarna was already hollowed, its golden walls echoing with emptiness. His great experiment collapsed almost overnight. The court dispersed, the rituals ended, and the Aten's temples were abandoned to the desert winds. The consequences of his excesses were swift. His successors, whether Smenkhkare, Nefertiti under another name, or eventually Tutankhamun, moved quickly to restore the old gods. Akhenaten's memory was cursed, his name chiseled from monuments, his legacy condemned as heresy. Egypt could forgive. The fall of Akhenaten's experiment did not end with his death. In fact, its consequences rippled across Egypt for generations, shaping how his dynasty was remembered, how religion was restored, and how scandal itself could topple a throne. The memory of the heretic king and his forbidden rituals became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no ruler, no matter how powerful, could defy the moral and spiritual order of Egypt without paying a terrible price. The backlash began almost immediately. Successors moved quickly to distance themselves from Akhenaten's legacy. Smenkhkare, perhaps a shadowy co-regent, perhaps another identity for Nefertiti, barely left a trace. Then came Tutankhaten, a boy who was swiftly renamed Tutankhamun to signal a return to the old gods. His reign, though brief, was a deliberate act of erasure. Temples to Aten were closed, shrines dismantled, statues smashed. The city of Amarna, once a glittering capital, was abandoned to the desert winds. Its streets, homes, and palaces fell into ruin, as if Egypt itself wanted to bury the memory of Akhenaten's excesses beneath the sands. This damnatio memoriae, the erasure of his name, was not merely political, it was moral. For the priesthood of Amun, reclaiming their power was as much about condemning Akhenaten's sexual transgressions as it was about restoring their gods. Rumors of incest, whispers of ritualized orgies, and tales of daughters drawn into forbidden unions were weaponized to portray him as unfit to rule. A degenerate who had not only insulted the gods, but corrupted the very foundations of family, life. By obliterating his legacy, Egypt sought to cleanse itself of the stain of his heresies, and yet, fragments endured. Archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered the ruins of Amarna, its walls decorated with intimate portrayals of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters. Unlike the stiff, distant art of earlier dynasties, these images were startlingly human, too human. The casual kisses, the caresses beneath Aten's rays, the almost sensual closeness of father and daughter shocked modern viewers just as it had scandalized ancient ones. Were these depictions symbolic, a radical attempt to show divine love? Or were they evidence of lived taboos, proof that Akhenaten had crossed lines that Egypt would never forgive? The long-term cultural impact was profound. Akhenaten's vision of a single god prefigured later monotheisms, but his blending of the sacred and the sexual ensured that his experiment would be remembered less as prophecy and more as perversion. His scandal hardened Egypt's attachment to tradition. Later rulers emphasized continuity, stability, and reverence for the old gods, careful never again to let one man's personal desires so deeply undermine the fabric of society. Even today, his story echoes. The line between religion and power, between intimacy and politics, remains blurred in many corners of the world. Modern scandals, leaders caught in webs of sexual excess, public morality undermined by private indulgence, resonate with the same themes that destroyed Akhenaten. His life remains a reminder that when rulers elevate their private desires into public law, the weight of scandal can topple even the mightiest throne. Akhenaten had sought immortality through Aten's light. Instead, he secured infamy, remembered not as a visionary, but as a warning, a ruler undone by the very rituals he believed would make him divine. The story of Akhenaten's court ends not with triumph, but with erasure. Yet even as his name was chiseled from stone and his memory condemned to oblivion, the shadow of his reign continues to haunt history. For what unfolded in Amarna was not just a religious revolution. It was a collision of desire, power, and taboo so profound that its echoes still reverberate across time. Akhenaten believed he could rewrite Egypt's reality. By exalting Aten as the sole god, he sought to make himself the prophet of a new order. By turning intimacy into ritual, he attempted to bind his court to him with a loyalty stronger than blood. But in doing so, he crossed boundaries that even his contemporaries could not forgive. Family became theatre, concubines became offerings, and daughters were portrayed in ways that blurred the lines between reverence and violation. What was meant to project divine authority instead cast a long shadow of suspicion and disgust. His legacy is not simply the ruins of Amarna or the eerie beauty of its art. It is the lesson that when rulers elevate their private obsessions into public doctrine, the entire fabric of society begins to unravel. The scandal of Akhenaten's court showed that the sacred can be corrupted, that devotion can be twisted into domination, and that even the mightiest empire cannot withstand the weight of one man's forbidden desires. For modern audiences, these revelations strike an unsettling chord. We live in a world where leaders, too, are often undone by their appetites. Scandals hidden behind palace walls, boardroom doors, or political chambers. The blending of sexuality and power remains a timeless pattern. Mistresses used as leverage, affairs weaponized for blackmail, intimacy turned into propaganda. When Akhenaten paraded his family as sacred vessels, he was not so far removed from today's leaders who craft images of purity while hiding corruption behind closed doors. And yet, the mystery endures. Were the depictions of Akhenaten and his daughters truly evidence of forbidden acts? Or were they misunderstood symbols of divine closeness? Did Nefertiti vanish because she defied the pharaoh's rituals, or because she sought to protect her children from them? Were the whispers of incest fact or propaganda crafted by priests eager to restore the old gods? The sands of Amarna guard these secrets still, leaving us with fragments and questions rather than certainty. But perhaps it is in these unanswered mysteries that Akhenaten's story grips us most. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that power and desire have always been intertwined, that morality is often the first casualty of ambition, and that history is as much shaped by whispers as it is by armies. So we are left with a haunting question. What other secrets lie buried in history's ruins? What other scandals, erased and forgotten, still wait to be unearthed? Akhenaten's court may have turned to dust, but its forbidden echoes remind us that the line between devotion and depravity is perilously thin, and that when rulers believe themselves gods, it is always the people who pay the price.